Awesome. So let's start with CV tips. A lot of people that watch this show, they're software developers, they work in tech, and they're maybe looking for the next opportunity, or they're always open to opportunities, and they don't really know what it takes to write a killer CV, one that's going to get people's attention. I always say that the point of a CV is to get an interview, and people often can't get interviews because they can't get the CV right. You've all looked at hundreds, if not thousands of CVs probably in your careers as software developers, front end, back end, full stack, and other types of tech roles as well. Would be keen to get your, we'll start with like what looks like a good CV to you, I suppose then, what sort of things stick out to you as appealing, interesting. When you see that, you're like, yeah, I'd love to interview that person. Adam, do you want to kick us off? What makes a good CV to you, mate?
It's always difficult. I think if we're talking about sort of tech in general, people always say, like tenure in jobs. And if people have got if someone's jumped from 3 months here, 3 months there, I suppose I used to do contract recruitment, so that doesn't put me off, but it will put hiring managers off. So obviously we need to have those conversations with them and explain that to them. I think generally if someone's had good tenures in places and not jumped around, is generally a good thing unless they've been contracting.
Do you know the problem with a lot of CVs is they've been contracting and they don't even mention it.
Yeah.
So you'll see a CV and it just says 3 months here, 6 months here, and like 90% of people would just reject it. When in reality, they're a great candidate. They want to go perm now, but they they just haven't mentioned the word contract on their CV, right?
100%. And I think it's laying those out. And sometimes actually, if you've done loads of stints in different places, generally people will always combat with, well, if they're any good, they would have stayed there for longer. But sometimes it might just be a 3-month job or it's a short project and that sort of thing. I think sometimes maybe condense them all into one, as in contracting, and these are these are the companies I worked at, and these are some of the projects that I worked on, basically. It's always difficult to say like these are good. I think it's easier to say bad things about CVs rather than good things.
We'll go to red flags, I suppose, in a second. But that's a good one to get us started. So good tenure, or at least explaining why the roles have been shorter if they've been contracts or something like that. What about yourself, Craig? What's good on a CV when you look at resumes?
I like to see tangible outcomes. So we're talking about technology CVs. So when a candidate says, did this, did that, worked with this, it's quite generic, and it's difficult to set apart people who have done more or have deeper knowledge in certain areas when the CV speaks the same. Whereas if someone can talk about tangible outcomes like saying that an automation they built reduced deployment time from 6 hours to 30 minutes. Those kinds of things will set you apart.
Yeah.
You also need to be able to back that up in an interview and talk about that succinctly. But those kinds of things will, they jump out to me because you get a lot of CVs that have a lot of tech just written on them.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes candidates think that it's a CV kind of keyword contest, but it's not. It's talk about what you did and trust that the recruiters at the other end and the reviewers at the other end understand enough of what they're talking about to be able to see through that you haven't written AWS on your CV 30 times and you've only written it twice.
Yeah.
Because we want to know what you're doing rather than, or what you've impacted rather than just what you were part of.
Yeah. I mean, keyword tech stuffing 10 years ago was good to get past algorithms and filters. Now it's, a little bit more advanced than that, and it's more about telling a story, like you say. I often say that bullet points can often equal bragging points in a humble way. Oftentimes people will just list, if you're a software developer, I write code, I gather user requirements, I deliver, and like if you're an engineering manager reading that, you know that's what they do as a software developer. So it's just wasted space. And the average CV is only looked at for like 10 seconds. So if that's how you're going to be selling yourself in those 10 seconds, it's not that appealing. So trying to have specific, I like the idea of numbers, metrics, examples, actual tangible achievements. So yeah, I think that's really, really good. I think combined those two ideas, I think like 50% of CVs would go from like a C to a B immediately. All right, what about yourself, Steve, on the, I suppose, more technical side? You're not a recruiter, you're a software engineering leader. What appeals to you when you look at resumes?
100% agree with what you just said. So to give you guys some context of like what goes through a hiring manager's mind, and especially in smaller companies like 500 people and less, if I've gone through the effort of like opening a vacancy, there's a very specific reason I've done that. I've either spotted a skills gap in my team, or I know that I've got a growth strategy over the next year and I need to bring in certain skills and abilities and whatnot. And I'll put those details in the job spec that I post up on LinkedIn or wherever you go to get your job specs. And I want to know that people who are coming into the company will help me deliver this vision. They will not come in and be a total liability, or they're not going to come in just because, as you said, they played keyword bingo with technologies. It's like, I did Java this one time in 2007. So that's something really important to bear in mind, right? And so coming back to your point, it's all about demonstrating impact. And I had this experience myself personally. So I worked at one company for a very, very long time, 12 years, and I was just completely out of the practice of applying for jobs. And I put my CV out there, and it was just, keyword bingo, and it just got rejected 1,000 times. And I had to really refine this. And eventually what I landed on was exactly the kind of examples you talked about. Like, I implemented this project that took, that increased profitability by X amount. This was what I did in there. And over time, like I started, so my CV is very little actual names of words and word bingo. And it's like every job that I've got listed on there is about like the achievement at the end of it. Yeah. And so this is kind of when I read someone's CV, this is what I'm looking for. It's like, I know what my strategy needs to be over the next year. So I need to know that this person that's going to come in has executed that before, or they've got the tenacity, or in some way they can demonstrate they've got a learning, they've got desire to learn. And so this is what I'm looking for. I'm looking for them demonstrating that they've had impact at their last role, ideally quantified with numbers. If you're I get it, if you're like a junior or mid-dev, you may not be able to do that, but like at a senior dev level, you may be able to talk about projects that you led and that kind of thing. And that's what starts getting my interest. On the flip side of this, like some really poor examples I see are sometimes people will just like print out their LinkedIn.
Oh yeah.
And there's like no details. It's just like, I worked at, I don't know, Barclays Bank and I did code. And you're just like,
and they're all the same format because they're auto-generated, so you can tell when they're... And it often shows if they're paying that little attention to detail when it comes to writing a CV, then what are they going to be like in the job a lot of the time? Oftentimes it's a good indicator, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like interviewing and CV writing and all of this is like a whole separate skill set to the job that you actually do, which is unfortunate. It's like you have to play this different game just to get onto the team. It's an unfortunate way of the world, but it exists for a reason. So I guess this is why it's important for anyone who's interviewing to understand the context of like what that hiring manager is looking for, what the company needs to achieve, these sorts of things, how your CV is going to be perceived by another hiring manager, etc. So like it's not just about things like beautiful formatting, which none of us have mentioned, but it is important. Sure. Like, your Comic Sans MS, like 5-page.
It's definitely a red flag. But I think as well, like you guys were saying, I think keywords aren't. I think they get a bad rep because I think they are quite key on a CV because I think a lot of the time if you're a software developer, you're applying for a job at a big company, it's going to hit a talent acquisition team the majority of the time first, and the majority of these talent acquisition guys may not have worked in tech before, or are not technical. I recruit for tech, but I'm not technical. I couldn't code anything. So I think it's still important because a lot of people will Control F. So if you have a skill, at least have it on your CV, because hiring managers will say, well, you as a recruiter, you'll say, right, what are the key things you're looking for? They'll give a list of them and maybe the technologies and things. And the first thing a lot of people do, Control F, have they got X, Y, Z on their CV? If they haven't, bin them off.
Or they've got JS instead of JavaScript, or Ang instead of Angular, or TS instead of TypeScript or something, right? And it seems silly when you're writing that, but if you look at it from the other person's perspective, if they're not going to find that on Control F, you're going into the deleted folder.
I would just say with CVs, you've got to just make things obvious. Yeah. Don't leave it down to an assumption. Just because you think people might know what you're talking about, they might not. And even from company to company, companies will call things the same thing and very different things. Sure. So just try and be as obvious as you can.
Okay.
Agree. always recommend putting the core tech stack that you've worked with in a role.
And the core tech stack, not something that you've used, like for
10
an
minutes.
hour. like 10 years ago. Like what is your key 10 technologies? Yeah.
And that's the point Adam's picking up on there, is do include what you've worked with, but don't list everything you have either touched or indirectly touched in that role. So if you spent 5 minutes in a 3-year window working with something, you probably are not going to be able to answer questions about it in the interview. So don't put it on your core tech stack. Stick the things that you're comfortable knowing and you're comfortable talking about and you feel confident on. But yes, do include the keywords still.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.